The candle had burned down to little more than a stub, and still Clara Winslow bent over her needle, her fingers moving with the practiced patience of a woman who had long ago learned that mending things was easier than mending a life. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor outside the sewing room, nor did she notice the shadow that paused, briefly, at the narrow gap beneath the door. She was entirely absorbed in her work, a length of grey silk torn along its seam, a housemaid's only good dress, ruined that afternoon when the girl had caught it on a nail in the linen room and wept as though the world had ended. Clara had told her not to fret. She had told her she would mend it that very night, free of any fee, because a housemaid's yearly wage did not stretch to replace a single gown, let alone the one dress a girl owned for church and holidays alike. She did not know that a man stood in the shadowed corridor, watching the thin line of candlelight beneath the door, listening to the small domestic sounds of thread being drawn and cloth being turned, and wondering, not for the first time that week, what manner of woman spent her own precious hours after midnight repairing another servant's dress for nothing at all, when so many others in her position would have counted the hour their own and guarded it jealously. He had come to Thornwood Hall under a name that was not his own, wearing a coat far plainer than the ones that hung, untouched, in his London wardrobe, for reasons he had not yet fully admitted, even to himself. He told himself he had come merely to observe his own household without the deference his title always summoned, to see the true character of the people who served him and the family who wished to marry into his fortune. He had not expected to find himself standing outside a sewing room at midnight, unable to make himself walk away. He did not yet know her name. He knew only that behind that door, by the dying light of a single candle, a woman was mending torn things with a tenderness that made something long frozen in his chest begin, very slowly, to ache. Clara had come to Thornwood Hall 6 months earlier, after her father's failed investments had swallowed the last of the Winslow family fortune and left her with little more than her needlework and her pride. She had been raised a gentleman's daughter, educated in music and French, and the delicate arts expected of a young lady destined for a comfortable marriage, and she had never once imagined that those same delicate arts, the fine, even stitches her governess had drilled into her as an ornamental accomplishment, would become the only skill standing between her family and the workhouse. She remembered, still, the particular humiliation of her first week at Thornwood, when a visiting lady of fashion had mistaken her for a common shopgirl and spoken to her with the careless condescension such women reserved for those beneath their notice, only to grow flustered and apologetic upon learning that the seamstress possessed a finer education than her own daughters. Clara had not corrected the woman's error out of any wounded vanity, but she had learned, in that small and bitter exchange, precisely how thin the line truly was between a gentlewoman and a servant, how easily the whole of a person's worth could be reduced, in the eyes of the world, to the cut of her gown and the calluses upon her fingers. She had resolved, from that day forward, never to let such judgments diminish her own sense of herself, whatever the world chose to assume. She did not resent the work, precisely. There was a quiet dignity in doing something well, even something as humble as mending, and she had found, in her months at Thornwood, a strange comfort in the rhythm of needle and thread. What she resented, when she allowed herself to resent anything at all, was the way the other servants sometimes looked at her, a gentleman's daughter reduced to hemming petticoats, and the way the housekeeper spoke to her with a careful, pitying gentleness reserved for those who had fallen furthest. She was not looking for pity that night, mending the housemaid's dress by candlelight, nor was she looking for anything at all beyond the small satisfaction of a seam well closed, which was precisely why she startled so badly when a low voice spoke from the doorway behind her. "You will ruin your eyes, working by so poor a light." Clara turned, her needle still clutched in her fingers, to find a man she did not recognize standing in the doorway, tall, dark-haired, dressed in the plain coat of an upper servant, though something in his bearing seemed to sit uneasily within such modest cloth, like a sword sheathed in the wrong scabbard. "Forgive me," she said, rising quickly and smoothing her apron. "I did not hear you approach. Are you newly arrived at the hall? I do not believe we have been introduced, though I confess I know most of the household staff, at least by face by now, if not always by name." "Hale," he said, after the briefest hesitation, as though the name required a moment's consideration before he could offer it. "I have been engaged to assist Mr. Fenn with the household accounts. I confess I lost my way somewhere between the East Wing and my own quarters, and found myself drawn instead toward your Candlelight." It was, Clara would later think, a strange sort of confession for a stranger to make, and stranger still, that she felt no alarm at it, only a curious warmth she could not quite explain. "Then you have found the sewing room, Mr. Hale, and precious little else of interest, I am afraid. Unless you have a torn coat in need of mending." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, she thought, though carefully restrained, as though laughter were a habit he had not practiced in some time. "As it happens, I do not. But I confess I am curious why a woman of your evident refinement spends her midnight hours mending a housemaid's dress. Surely such labor falls beneath the notice of most in your position." Clara's chin lifted, a small defensive motion she had perfected over 6 months of careful pride. "I do not know what position you imagine I occupy, Mr. Hale, but I promise you, I have very little use for notions of what falls beneath my notice, nor patience for those who measure kindness by the rank of the person offering or receiving it. Sarah tore her only good dress this afternoon, and wept as though she had lost a fortune, because for her, in a manner of speaking, she had. I can mend a seam in an hour. It seemed a poor excuse not to." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze, careful, searching, entirely unlike the dismissive glances she usually received from men of the household staff, made her feel, absurdly, as though she were being read like a difficult passage in a favorite book. "That is a kind answer," he said finally. "Kinder than I expected, and kinder, I think, than most in this house would trouble themselves to offer a stranger who wandered in uninvited." "Expected from whom?" "From anyone," he said, and there was something in his voice, some old and private weariness, that made her wonder what precisely had taught a man to expect so little kindness from the world. "Good evening, Miss Winslow," she supplied. "Clara Winslow. Miss Winslow." He inclined his head, an oddly formal gesture for a household clerk, and withdrew into the corridor as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Clara standing alone in the guttering candlelight with the strange, unsettled sense that she had just spoken to someone considerably more than he claimed to be. She did not know, as she resumed her mending long after his footsteps had faded, that the man calling himself Hale was in fact Sebastian Calloway, 7th Duke of Thornwood, master of the very house in which she now labored. Nor did she know that he had returned to that darkened corridor 3 more times before dawn, unable to make himself walk away from the small, steady light beneath the sewing-room door. He told himself, in the days that followed, that his continued presence near the sewing-room was merely a matter of curiosity, the natural interest of a man observing the true character of a household he had spent too many years governing from a careful, dutiful distance. He had come to Thornwood that season under his assumed name, for reasons that had little to do with sewing rooms or candlelight. His aunt, Lady Augusta, had spent the better part of 2 years arranging his marriage to Miss Vivian Sterling, a young woman of considerable fortune and considerable ambition, and Sebastian had grown weary of receiving reports of Vivian's charm and accomplishment second-hand, filtered always through the flattering lens of people eager to see the match succeed. He wished, before committing the whole of his future to a woman he barely knew, to observe his own household, and by extension, the character of the people who would soon populate it, without the careful performance his title always summoned. A duke received only what people wished him to see. A household clerk, named Hale, he had reasoned, might see something closer to the truth. There was another reason too. one he permitted himself to examine only in the loneliest hours of the night. He had been engaged once before, briefly, to a young woman of good family who had professed, with great conviction, an affection for him that had proven, in the end, to be affection for his title alone, a truth he had learned only after the engagement was quietly dissolved and she had married, within the year, a marquis of considerably greater fortune than his own. The betrayal had not broken his heart so much as it had hollowed something quieter and more essential within him, his capacity to trust that any woman's tenderness toward him was not, at bottom, a calculation dressed in the appearance of feeling. He had carried that hollowness through 5 subsequent years of careful, guarded courtship, growing steadily more convinced that genuine, disinterested affection simply did not exist for a man of his rank, until the moment he stood outside a sewing-room door and heard a woman speak, with such unthinking generosity, of mending a housemaid's dress for nothing at all. He had not expected the truth to take the shape of a seamstress with tired eyes and an unyielding sense of quiet justice, mending a servant's dress for nothing more than the simple conviction that kindness required no excuse. He found reasons to return. He brought a torn cravat that did not, in truth, require nearly so careful a repair as he requested, and sat in uncomfortable silence while Clara stitched it, asking her small questions about her life before Thornwood, that she answered with a caution he found himself admiring rather than resenting. He learned, in careful pieces offered across several evenings, that her father had lost everything in a disastrous investment scheme, that her mother had died when Clara was young, that she had a younger brother at school whose fees she paid from her own meager wages, sacrificing new gowns and warm shawls and every small comfort a young woman might otherwise claim for herself. "You give up a great deal for a brother who is not even here to see it," he observed one evening, watching her mend a torn glove with the same unhurried care she gave to everything. "He does not need to see it," Clara said simply. "That is rather the point of sacrifice, I think. If it required an audience, it would only be performance." The words settled into him with unexpected force, striking some private wound he had carried since his own father's death, a wound born of years spent performing dukedom for an audience of tenants and creditors and ambitious families, never once permitted the luxury of sacrifice offered without witness. He thought of his aunt's careful public displays of family devotion, of Vivian Sterling's practiced charm deployed always before the largest possible audience, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that he had never once in his adult life met anyone who gave freely of themselves without calculating, somewhere in the back of their mind, what such generosity might earn them in return. He did not know, yet, how deeply he had already begun to fall. Clara, for her part, found herself thinking of Mr. Hale far more often than a woman in her circumstances could reasonably afford. There was something in his stillness that unsettled her, not the stillness of a man with nothing to say, but the stillness of a man carefully weighing every word before he permitted himself to speak it, as though speech itself were a currency he had learned to spend with great caution. He asked questions no other man in the household ever thought to ask her, not about her sewing, but about her opinions, her private griefs, the books she read in her rare hours of leisure, and he listened to her answers with an attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in 6 long months, like something more than a pair of useful hands. She told herself it meant nothing, and she told herself so with a particular urgency born of old experience, for Clara Winslow had once before permitted herself to hope, and had learned precisely how costly such hoping could become. Before her father's ruin, she had been all but promised to a young gentleman of modest fortune, a match her family had encouraged, and her own heart had welcomed with the easy confidence of a girl who had never yet been taught to doubt her worth. The engagement had dissolved within a fortnight of her father's bankruptcy becoming public knowledge, the young man's family withdrawing their blessing with a swiftness that left no room for misunderstanding. A Winslow without fortune, it seemed, was a Winslow no longer worth marrying. She had not wept over the loss of the young man himself, whom she had never loved with any great depth, but she had wept, privately and bitterly, over the lesson the whole affair had taught her, that her worth, in the eyes of the world that mattered, had never truly resided in her character at all, but in the fortune that once accompanied it, and had vanished the very instant that fortune did. It was this old wound, more than any present caution, that made her guard so carefully against the growing warmth she felt for a man who called himself Hale. She could not risk hoping again, not when hope had once cost her so dearly, and yet she found, despite every careful resolution, that she lingered longer in the sewing-room each evening than her work strictly required, hoping, in some small unacknowledged corner of her heart, that the candlelight beneath her door might draw him back again. It was the torn dress, her own dress this time, and not another servant's, that first threatened to expose the growing tenderness between them. There were smaller moments, too, in those early weeks, that Clara would later recall with a tenderness sharpened by hindsight, moments that seemed, at the time, like nothing more than ordinary kindnesses, but which she understood later to be the quiet architecture of a man falling in love, without permitting himself to name it. There was the evening he found her mending a page boy's coat, the child having outgrown 3 previous garments in a single winter, and his family too poor to replace what he had ruined, climbing the stable roof on a dare. Hale had watched her let out the seams with a seamstress's economy, adding a false hem that could be released again come spring, and had said nothing at all, only returned the following week with a bolt of sturdy wool he claimed had been left over from a household order, though Clara suspected, even then, that no such surplus had ever truly existed. There was the afternoon she confessed, in a rare unguarded moment, that she had once dreamed of training as a proper modiste in London before her father's ruin closed every such possibility to her, and he had listened with such careful attention that she found herself, days later, still turning over the memory of his stillness, the particular quality of a man who did not merely hear words but weighed them, kept them, seemed almost to treasure them. And there was the night, perhaps a month into their strange acquaintance, when a sudden autumn storm trapped them both in the sewing-room long past any reasonable hour, rain lashing the narrow window while they sat in companionable silence, she mending, he simply watching, until at last he spoke into the quiet with a rawness she had not heard from him before. "I envy you," he said. Clara looked up, startled. "Envy me, Mr. Hale. I possess very little in this world worth envying." "You possess a purpose no one gave you, and no one can take away," he said. "You mend things because you choose to, because it is good and useful and asks nothing of you but honest effort. I have spent my whole life inheriting purposes rather than choosing them. A name, a fortune, a great many obligations I never once selected for myself. I do not think I have chosen a single thing freely since I was a boy, Miss Winslow, until perhaps these past weeks, spent in a sewing-room I have no earthly business visiting." She did not fully understand, then, the weight behind his words, nor the particular ache of a man burdened by inheritance rather than freed by it, but she understood enough to reach across the small space between them and rest her hand, briefly, over his, a gesture she would never have permitted herself with any other man of the household, and one that startled them both with its quiet intimacy. "Then choose this," she said softly. "For as long as the storm keeps you here at least, choose to simply sit and mend nothing, and be nothing more than a man resting by a fire he did not have to earn, with no ledger to balance and no name to defend, only the rain and the candlelight and an hour that belongs, for once, entirely to himself." He did not answer her in words, but something in his face, a loosening, a softening, the particular relief of a man permitted, for one stolen hour, to simply exist without performance, told her everything she needed to know, and it was that unspoken answer, more than any declaration he might later have offered her, that Clara would remember as the true beginning of her love for him. It was the torn dress, her own dress this time, and not another servant's, that first threatened to expose the growing tenderness between them. The gown had belonged to her mother, a fine ivory silk, grown soft and fragile with age, the last remaining possession of any real beauty that Clara owned. She had kept it folded carefully in her small trunk since her mother's death, unworn and unaltered, a private relic of a life that no longer existed. But Lady Augusta, planning an autumn gathering to formally introduce Miss Sterling to the county's most influential families, had decreed that every unmarried woman of the household, down to the companions and senior servants, should attend a small evening reception in the orangery, and Clara, possessing no other gown fit for such an occasion, had determined, after days of private agonizing, to alter her mother's dress to fit her own considerably slighter frame. She worked on it for 3 nights running, long after the rest of the household had retired, unpicking seams with a care that bordered on reverence, terrified of damaging the one beautiful thing she still possessed. It was on the 3rd night, with the gown nearly finished and draped across her lap in the candlelight, that the fabric caught against a splintered chair leg and tore, a long, ragged rip along the bodice that made Clara press her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry of genuine grief. She did not hear Hale enter the room until he was kneeling beside her chair, his expression uncharacteristically alarmed. "Miss Winslow, what has happened?" "Nothing," she said, though her voice cracked around the word. "Nothing that signifies. Only my mother's dress, and I have ruined it entirely, and I have no fabric to replace what is torn, and no funds to purchase more, and I am being entirely foolish over a garment that is, in the end, only cloth." "It is not only cloth," he said quietly, "if it was your mother's." Something in the gentleness of his voice undid the careful composure she had maintained for 6 long months, and to her own considerable mortification, she found herself weeping, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, exhausted grief of a woman who had held herself together through a great many losses, and had finally, over a torn seam, come undone. He did not attempt to stop her tears, nor did he offer the brisk, uncomfortable comfort most men reserved for weeping women. He simply remained beside her, steady and quiet, until the worst of it had passed, and then, without a word, he took up the torn fabric himself and examined it with a care that surprised her. "The tear runs along the seam," he said. "It can be closed, I think, if the thread is fine enough and the hand steady enough. May I?" "You know how to mend a seam, Mr. Hale?" She could not entirely keep the astonishment from her voice. "I know a great many things I do not often have occasion to use," he said, with a faint, rueful smile that told her nothing and everything at once. "Will you show me?" She did, and for the better part of an hour, Duke Sebastian Calloway of Thornwood knelt beside a sewing-room chair, guided by a poor gentlewoman's steady instruction, and mended his own household's torn silk, with hands that had never once in his adult life performed a single task he had not delegated to someone else. It was, he would think later, one of the strangest and most genuinely happy hours he had spent in years. Not because the work itself held any particular pleasure, but because for that single hour, kneeling in candlelight beside a woman who did not know his name, he was permitted to simply be useful, ordinary, and entirely unguarded, in a way his title had never once allowed him to be. The dress was mended by the time the candle burned low, the tear closed so carefully that only the most careful eye could have found the seam at all, and Clara, examining the finished work, felt something shift and settle in her chest that frightened her considerably more than the torn silk ever had. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the dress, and for—" she hesitated, unwilling to name the thing she truly meant to thank him for, the quiet company of an hour that had asked nothing of her beyond honesty. "You need not thank me," he said, rising and gathering his coat. "I confess, I have rarely spent an evening more usefully." He did not tell her, that night, why a household clerk should speak with such careful authority, nor why the housekeeper, passing him in the corridor the following morning, had bowed with a deference that no ordinary clerk ever received. Clara noticed it, as she had begun to notice 100 small inconsistencies in the weeks since their first meeting. The fineness of his linen beneath his plain coat, the signet ring he wore on a chain and never removed, the careful, cultured cadence of his speech that no household clerk's education could easily explain, the way he sometimes caught himself before issuing an instruction to another servant, correcting his tone at the last moment, as though remembering, mid-sentence, that he was meant to occupy no authority at all. She did not confront him. Some quiet, self-protective instinct warned her that whatever truth he concealed was not born of cruelty, and she found herself, against every careful lesson her ruined family had taught her about trusting too easily, unwilling to force a reckoning before either of them was ready for it. It was Lady Augusta who first threatened to end their fragile, undeclared understanding, though she did not yet know precisely what she threatened. The Duke's aunt had grown suspicious of her nephew's frequent absences from the drawing-room, his evenings spent, by all household accounts, closeted with Mr. Fenn over accounts that, in Lady Augusta's considerable experience of estate management, did not require nearly so many hours of private attention. She questioned Mr. Fenn directly and received only careful, evasive answers that only sharpened her suspicion, and she took to watching the household's comings and goings with the particular vigilance of a woman who had spent 2 years and considerable effort arranging a marriage she did not intend to see disrupted by some inconvenient distraction. She found Clara alone in the linen room one grey afternoon, sorting mended garments into their proper places, and closed the door behind her with a quiet finality that made Clara's stomach tighten with immediate apprehension. "Miss Winslow," Lady Augusta said, without preamble, "I understand you have been receiving a great deal of attention from a member of the household staff of late. A Mr. Hale, I am told, engaged to assist with the accounts." Clara kept her hands steady on the folded linen, though her pulse had begun to race. "He has brought me items to mend, my lady, as is my occupation here. I am not aware that this constitutes any impropriety." "I did not accuse you of impropriety. I am merely observing that a young woman in your position, dependent entirely upon this household's goodwill, with a family fortune too diminished to offer any protection, should that goodwill be withdrawn, would do well to guard against attachments that can only end poorly for her. Whatever kindness Mr. Hale has shown you, Miss Winslow, I promise you it cannot end in anything resembling a future. Men of a certain class amuse themselves easily with women who cannot refuse their attentions without risking their livelihood. I would not see you learn that lesson through heartbreak, when a simple warning might spare you the worst of it." The words struck with a precision that suggested Lady Augusta understood a great deal more about her nephew's habits than she had yet openly admitted, and Clara felt the colour drain from her face, even as she fought to keep her voice steady. "I have given Mr. Hale no encouragement beyond ordinary courtesy, my lady. I do not know what you imagine has occurred between us, but I assure you it is nothing that could threaten anyone's position or reputation." "See that it remains so," Lady Augusta said, and swept from the room without another word, leaving Clara standing amid the folded linens with her heart pounding and a cold, creeping dread settling into her chest, not because she believed Lady Augusta's warning entirely just, but because some part of her, some quiet and long-suppressed hope, feared that it might be. She did not tell Hale of the encounter, though she found herself, in the days that followed, watching him with a new and painful wariness, and wondering, with a growing unease she could not entirely name, precisely what manner of man commanded such careful deference from a lady who spoke to her own nephew's clerk with such pointed, deliberate warning. She did not tell Hale of the encounter, though she found herself, in the days that followed, watching him with a new and painful wariness, and wondering, with a growing unease she could not entirely name, precisely what manner of man commanded such careful deference from a lady who spoke to her own nephew's clerk with such pointed, deliberate warning. Miss Vivian Sterling arrived at Thornwood Hall a week later, accompanied by her mother and a retinue of trunks that spoke plainly of a woman who had already begun, in her own mind, to arrange the household to her liking. She was, by any fair measure, a handsome and accomplished young woman, quick with conversation and confident in her bearing, and Clara, glimpsing her across the hall on her second morning at Thornwood, felt a small, unwelcome pang of comparison she was not proud of. It was Miss Sterling herself, however, who sought Clara out, not out of any suspicion of the truth, but out of the idle, faintly condescending curiosity of a woman accustomed to knowing every detail of a household she intended soon to command. "You are the seamstress everyone speaks of," Miss Sterling said, finding Clara in the linen room one afternoon and examining her with the frank, appraising look of a woman assessing a piece of furniture. "Lady Augusta tells me you are remarkably skilled. I shall have need of a great deal of alteration once the wedding gown arrives from London. French lace does not always sit well on an English figure, and I confess I trust no local modiste with anything so delicate." "I would be glad to assist however I am able, miss," Clara said, keeping her voice carefully even, though something in her chest had tightened at the casual mention of a wedding gown already ordered, already crossing the channel, already assuming a future that Clara had not permitted herself to examine too closely. "You seem a sensible sort of girl," Miss Sterling continued, oblivious to the effect of her words. "I understand your family met with some misfortune. It is fortunate you have found useful employment here, rather than languishing in genteel poverty, as so many ruined families do. The Duke's household is generous, I am told, to those who serve it faithfully and do not overreach their position." She said it lightly, without any evident malice, but the words landed with the precision of a warning nonetheless, and Clara understood, with a sinking clarity, that whatever quiet happiness she had begun to build in candlelit evenings existed entirely outside the world Miss Sterling occupied so effortlessly, a world in which women like Clara served, and women like Vivian were served, and the distance between the two was never meant to be crossed. She said nothing of the encounter to Hale, though it settled into her like a stone, and in the days that followed she found herself withdrawing, however slightly, from the easy warmth that had grown between them, uncertain whether the affection she felt for a household clerk could survive the shadow of a wedding gown already crossing the sea. The truth arrived, in the end, not gently but all at once, on the evening of Lady Augusta's autumn reception in the orangery. Clara had finished her mother's mended dress at last, and though her hands shook with nerves she could not entirely suppress, she dressed for the small gathering with a fragile hope she had not permitted herself in months, the hope that perhaps, for one evening, she might be seen not as a fallen gentlewoman reduced to mending, but simply as herself, dressed in her mother's careful silk, worthy of some small measure of the world's kindness. She did not expect, upon entering the orangery's warm, candle-lit glow, to find the assembled company turning as one toward the doorway on the opposite side of the room, where Lady Augusta stood beaming beside a tall, dark-haired gentleman in a coat of deep blue superfine, his bearing entirely transformed from the careful, unassuming clerk she had come to know, though his face, unmistakably, was the same face that had knelt beside her sewing-room chair only weeks before. "His Grace, the Duke of Thornwood," the butler announced, and the whole of Clara's careful, fragile hope shattered at once, silently, into 1,000 pieces she was not certain she would ever manage to gather again. She stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, her mother's mended silk suddenly feeling less like a private relic of love and more like a costume worn to a masquerade she had never known she was attending, and watched as Miss Vivian Sterling, golden-haired, radiant, entirely at ease amid the glittering assembly, crossed the room to take the Duke's arm with the easy familiarity of a woman who had every reason to expect she would soon be his wife. Clara did not wait to hear what followed. She turned and fled through the orangery's glass doors into the cold evening garden beyond, her mother's mended dress catching on a low branch and tearing anew along the very seam Sebastian's careful hands had closed only weeks before. A small, cruel symmetry that struck her, in that moment, as almost unbearably fitting. She pressed her palm against the tear without truly registering the pain of the scratch beneath it, her mind reeling backward through every evening she had spent in that candle-lit sewing room, every question she had answered with such careless honesty, every private grief she had confessed to a man she now understood had never once been in any danger of losing anything by listening. He had risked nothing. She had risked everything, her composure, her guarded heart, the last fragile shreds of dignity she had carried out of her family's ruin, and he had accepted every offering with the easy, practiced calm of a man who had known, the whole while, precisely how little any of it could truly cost him. Worse than the deception itself was the sudden, sickening clarity of what it meant for her future. She understood now with brutal plainness, nothing more than a servant who had briefly amused her employer during the long tedium of a marriage negotiation, a diversion he would soon set gently aside, as a gentleman set aside any pastime grown inconvenient the moment his true bride required his full attention. She thought of Miss Sterling's casual warning in the linen room, the careful reminder not to overreach her position, and understood now that the warning had been, however unwittingly, entirely correct. He saw her go. He had felt her presence in the room from the instant she entered, some instinct honed over weeks of stolen candlelit evenings, recognizing her before his eyes ever confirmed it. And when he turned and saw her stricken face vanish through the glass doors, he understood, with a horror that nearly stopped him mid-step, exactly what she now believed of him. He could not follow immediately. His aunt's hand remained fixed upon his arm, Vivienne Sterling's expectant smile fixed upon his face, 300 candles and twice that many watching eyes fixed upon his every movement, and he endured perhaps the longest hour of his adult life, smiling the smiles his title required, while every part of him strained toward the garden door through which Clara Winslow had disappeared. When at last he broke free of the gathering, the garden was empty, and Clara was gone. She did not return to the sewing room that night, nor the night after. She kept to the small servants' quarters she shared with 2 other women, mending only what duties strictly required, speaking to no one of the ache lodged permanently now beneath her ribs. She understood, turning the humiliation over and over in her mind through sleepless nights, that the Duke had not deceived her out of cruelty precisely. She did not truly believe, whatever her wounded pride insisted in its darker hours, that he had set out to make a fool of her. But understanding did not lessen the sting of it. Every honest confession she had offered him, every private grief, every unguarded hour spent mending torn things by candlelight, had been given to a man who held her entire livelihood, her family's remaining security, her very roof over her head, in the casual grip of his concealed rank. She had not merely lost her heart to a man who was not what he claimed. She had handed her heart, unknowing, to the very power that could destroy her with a single careless word, and no amount of tenderness in his eyes could entirely erase the vertigo of that realization. He sent for her 3 times through Mr. Fenn, requesting she attend him in the library, and 3 times she sent back word, through trembling hands and a composure she did not truly feel, that her duties left her no leisure for private audiences. She could not risk what a 4th refusal might cost her position, and yet neither could she make herself face him, not yet, not while the wound remained so raw that she feared what her own traitorous heart might confess, if given the chance. The other servants noticed her withdrawal, though none of them understood its cause, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Adler, a woman of considerable years and considerable perception, finally cornered Clara in the linen room one evening, with the particular directness of someone who had watched a great many young women suffer in silence and had grown impatient with the practice. "You have not been yourself this fortnight," Mrs. Adler said, folding a stack of pillow slips with brisk efficiency that did not match the gentleness of her tone. "I do not ask you to confess what troubles you, Miss Winslow, for I suspect I have already guessed a fair portion of it. But I will say this much. Having served this family the better part of 30 years, His Grace's father made a marriage entirely of advantage, and I watched that good man grow smaller and quieter with every year of it, until there was scarcely enough of him left by the end to fill the coat he wore. I do not know what passed between you and the young man who called himself Hale, but I have never in 30 years seen the present Duke smile the way he smiled, walking these corridors these past months. Nor have I seen him look so thoroughly wretched as he has looked this past fortnight. Whatever pride keeps you from him, Miss Winslow, I would ask you to weigh it carefully against what it might cost you both to let it win. Clara had no ready answer for the housekeeper's blunt wisdom, and she carried the words with her through several more sleepless nights, turning them over alongside her own private grief, unable yet to decide whether pride or genuine wisdom kept her from Sebastian's door. It was Lady Augusta, unexpectedly, who forced the reckoning neither of them seemed able to force alone. The Duke's aunt, having observed her nephew's uncharacteristic distraction in the days following the reception, his short temper, his neglected correspondence, the way his eyes drifted repeatedly toward the sewing-room wing during meals he barely touched, arrived at a conclusion considerably more perceptive than either Sebastian or Clara had credited her capable of reaching. "You have fallen in love with the seamstress," Lady Augusta said flatly, cornering her nephew in his study one evening with the particular directness she reserved for matters too serious for subtlety. "I will not pretend I approve. I have spent 2 years securing Miss Sterling's fortune for this family's future, and I do not relish watching that effort collapse over a woman whose entire estate consists of a needle and a great deal of misplaced pride. But I am not, whatever you may believe of me, entirely without sentiment. I watched your father waste half his life in a marriage arranged for advantage rather than affection, and I will not pretend the result brought this family anything but quiet misery dressed in fine clothes. If you truly love this girl, Sebastian, then stop hiding behind clerks' coats and false names, and go to her honestly, before your cowardice costs you the one thing your father never had the courage to claim for himself." It was, Sebastian would later reflect, the single kindest thing his aunt had ever said to him, delivered with all the warmth of a woman reading aloud from a ledger, and he did not waste another day acting upon it. He found Clara in the small walled kitchen garden behind the servants' quarters, gathering the last of the season's lavender in the fading afternoon light, and she stiffened the moment she saw him approaching, her spine straightening with the particular rigid dignity of a woman determined not to let hurt show plainly upon her face. "Your Grace," she said, and the title fell between them like a closed door. "I did not expect a duke to trouble himself with a seamstress's garden." "I am not here as a duke," he said quietly. "I am here as Hale, if you will still permit me the name, though I understand entirely if you will not." "Hale does not exist," she said, and her voice, though steady, carried a tremor of genuine grief beneath its careful control. "He was never real. I spent weeks confessing things to a man who did not exist, Your Grace, while the man who did exist watched me weep over a torn dress and said nothing at all of the power he held over my very livelihood. Do you understand what that means to a woman in my position? Every kindness I showed you, I showed freely, believing myself speaking to an equal. Had I known the truth, I would have guarded every word. You did not merely conceal your name, you took from me the choice of how carefully to protect myself." The accusation landed with the precision of a blade, and he did not attempt to deflect it. "You are right," he said. "I have no defense that erases that theft, and I will not insult you by offering one. I can only tell you why I did it, and trust you to judge whether the reason redeems anything at all. I came to Thornwood disguised because I had spent my whole life surrounded by people who valued my title far more than my character, and I no longer trusted myself to distinguish genuine affection from calculated ambition. I did not disguise myself to deceive you, Miss Winslow. I disguised myself because I no longer knew how to be loved for anything but my name, and some part of me, some part I did not fully understand until I stood outside your sewing room door that first night, hoped desperately to find out whether such a thing was still possible. And what of Miss Sterling? Clara asked, and though she tried to keep the question light, some raw thread of hurt ran through it that she could not entirely disguise. Was she too a test you conducted while wearing your true face, or did I mistake the announcement I heard so plainly at your aunt's reception? There was never any true understanding between myself and Miss Sterling, whatever my aunt's ambitions arranged on paper, he said. I met her exactly 4 times before that evening, each occasion managed so carefully by Lady Augusta that I scarcely spoke a private word to her at all. I do not say this to excuse my silence about the arrangement. I ought to have told you of it the very first week, and my failure to do so is a wound I understand I cannot simply argue away. I say it only so that you do not carry the added grief of believing I courted 2 women at once with equal sincerity. I courted no one sincerely until you, Clara. That is the whole of the truth, however poorly I managed to protect you from the uncertainty of not knowing it. And do you imagine, she said, her voice unsteady now, that a title so easily explains away every silence? Every evening I spent believing myself your equal, while you alone understood the true distance between us. I imagine nothing of the kind, he said quietly. I imagine only that I owe you the whole of my honesty now, offered without any further concealment, and that whatever you decide to do with it is entirely your own choice to make. I have taken enough choices from you already, Clara. I will not compound that theft by asking you to forgive me on any schedule but your own. Something in the quiet humility of that answer, the absence of any further pleading, any further attempt to hurry her toward a forgiveness she was not yet ready to offer, loosened, very slightly, the tight grip of hurt she had carried since the reception. She did not answer him that evening, though she did not turn away either, and Sebastian took what fragile comfort he could from the fact that she had not yet asked him to leave. He kept his word in the weeks that followed with a patience that surprised even Lady Augusta, who had never once witnessed her nephew pursue anything with such careful, unhurried devotion. He did not press Clara for declarations she was not ready to give. He simply appeared, honestly now, without disguise or false name, bringing small kindnesses that asked nothing in return. Books from the estate library he thought she might enjoy, a length of fine thread he had travelled to the county town himself to purchase, quiet company on her rare afternoons of leisure that never once presumed upon more intimacy than she offered freely. He answered every question she asked about his former deception with unflinching honesty, however uncomfortable the answers proved, and slowly, carefully, the wariness in her eyes began to soften into something that resembled, at first cautiously, and then with growing warmth, trust rebuilt, rather than trust simply assumed. It was her own younger brother, home from school for the Christmas holidays and quick to notice the change in his sister's correspondence, who finally pressed her toward the courage she had been circling for weeks. "You write his name in nearly every letter now," young Thomas Winslow observed, with the particular bluntness of a boy not yet old enough to have learned the value of tact, "though you never once say what you mean to do about it. Do you love him, Clara, or do you not? Because if you do, I cannot see what further proof you require, when he has already given up a fortune and a fine marriage for the chance to earn your good opinion honestly." Clara had no ready answer for her brother's plain logic, and she did not attempt one. She only understood, turning his words over through a long and sleepless night, that she had spent weeks testing Sebastian's patience, not because she doubted his sincerity any longer, but because some frightened part of herself could not quite believe that a woman reduced to mending other people's torn dresses might still be permitted a whole and unbroken happiness of her own. She found him, the following morning, in the very orangery where her heart had first shattered, standing alone among the winter greenery, with an expression of such quiet, patient hope that something in her chest, finally, fully, let go of the fear she had carried since that terrible evening. "I have decided," she said, without preamble, "that I am tired of guarding my heart so carefully that it forgets how to be happy. Sebastian crossed the small distance between them with a speed that betrayed every careful patience he had practiced for weeks. "And what has your heart decided, Clara Winslow?" "That it belongs to a man who once mended a torn seam beside me in Candlelight and asked for nothing in return but the chance to be ordinary for a single honest hour," she said, her voice steady now, sure. "Whatever name he goes by and whatever coat he wears." He kissed her then, in the pale winter light of the very room where deception had once torn them apart, and if the assembled household staff, passing the orangery windows on their morning errands, paused to witness their Duke embracing a seamstress with an ardor entirely unbefitting his rank, not one of them found it in themselves to disapprove, for by then the whole of Thornwood had watched the quiet transformation in their master closely enough to understand exactly what, and whom, had finally taught him how to be happy. The wedding, when it came the following spring, was a smaller affair than Thornwood Hall had seen in a generation, held not in the grand cathedral favoured by families of the Duke's consequence, but in the same orangery where truth and reconciliation had finally found each other. Its glass walls hung with the last of the season's lavender, and every candle in the household gathered to fill the space with a warm, golden glow that Clara would remember, for the whole of her life, as the truest kind of beauty she had ever witnessed. Young Thomas Winslow gave his sister away, standing straighter and prouder than any boy of his age had a right to stand, and wept without shame through the whole of the brief ceremony, a fact he would deny for years afterward, whenever the household staff teased him gently for it. Mrs. Adler, the housekeeper whose blunt wisdom had first nudged Clara toward reconciliation, occupied a seat of honor near the front, dabbing at her own eyes with a handkerchief she claimed was merely troubled by the lavender's scent, though no one in the room was fooled by the excuse. Lady Augusta, reconciled at last to a match she privately admitted suited her nephew's happiness far better than any fortune Vivian Sterling might have brought him, stood witness with something approaching genuine warmth, and arranged, without ever quite admitting to the kindness, a modest position for young Thomas Winslow within the estate's own administration upon his completion of school, a gesture Clara understood and quietly treasured, for the peace offering it truly was. And when the vows had been spoken and the small gathering had scattered to celebrate among the candlelit orangery, Sebastian drew his new duchess aside and pressed into her hands a small, carefully wrapped parcel he had kept hidden through the whole of the ceremony, her mother's mended ivory silk, restored now beyond even its original beauty by a London seamstress he had quietly commissioned, every torn seam replaced with fabric so fine it seemed almost to glow beneath the candlelight. "I could not bear to see it torn again," he said, "not when it was the very seam that first taught me how to be useful to someone I loved, rather than merely powerful over them." "You foolish, wonderful man," Clara said, her voice thick with tears that carried nothing now but joy. "You might simply have told me who you were, from the very first evening." "I might have," he agreed, drawing her close beneath the orangery's glass dome, where the last of the wedding candles cast their warm and steady light across a room that had once held such careful sorrow and now held nothing but hope. "But then I would never have learned what it felt like to be loved for nothing but the man mending a torn seam beside you in the candlelight, and I find, Clara, having finally known that particular joy, that I would not trade it for every title or fortune this world could offer me twice over." In the years that followed, the story told among the tenants and villagers of Thornwood shifted gradually from a tale of a proud, distant duke who had once tested his household in secret into something warmer and more enduring, the story of a seamstress who mended torn things without ever once asking what her kindness might earn her, and found, in the end, that the very hands she had taught to close a broken seam had gone on, quietly and faithfully, to mend the whole of a lonely duke's guarded heart. Mothers told it to their daughters as a lesson in the quiet power of unwitnessed goodness, and to their sons as a caution against ever mistaking a plain coat for a plain heart, reminding them always that the truest measure of a man lay not in the cut of his coat or the weight of his purse, but in the small, unwatched kindnesses he offered when he believed no one of consequence was watching at all. And on quiet evenings, when the candles were lit and the great house had settled into its gentle hush, one could still find the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood together in the small sewing room where it had all begun, not testing each other any longer, nor hiding behind names that were never truly theirs, but simply two people who had learned, in the most unexpected of candlelit hours, that the truest love asks for no audience at all, and mends, stitch by patient stitch, even the most carefully guarded of hearts. Clara kept the sewing room exactly as it had always been, refusing every offer to have it enlarged or refitted in the grander style the rest of the house now enjoyed, because she understood, better than anyone, that some rooms held their value not in their splendor, but in their memory. She still mended dresses there on quiet evenings, though no longer from necessity. She mended them now because the rhythm of needle and thread had become, over the years, a kind of prayer she was unwilling to surrender, a private ritual that reminded her, whenever her new and considerable fortune threatened to make her forget, of exactly what patient, unwitnessed kindness had once cost her, and exactly what it had, in the end, so generously returned. Sebastian found her there often, in the years that followed, and never once entered without pausing first at the door, watching the candlelight fall across her steady hands, remembering with a tenderness that never dulled the first night he had stood in that very corridor, unable to make himself walk away from a woman who did not yet know she had already begun, quietly and without any intention at all, to mend him. Their own daughter, born some years later, grew up hearing the story told a dozen different ways by a dozen different members of the household. Mrs. Adler's version always emphasized the housekeeper's own decisive wisdom, while young Thomas, grown into a steady and capable man by then, preferred to credit his own blunt honesty for finally pushing his sister toward courage. Lady Augusta's version, offered rarely and only after considerable wine, always began with the words, "I saw it before either of them did," which was, in its own way, entirely true. But Clara's version, the one she told her daughter, on quiet evenings, in the very sewing room where it had all begun, needle in hand and candlelight flickering gently across the walls, never varied at all. "I did not fall in love with a duke," she would say, guiding her daughter's small fingers through the careful motion of a simple stitch. "I fell in love with a man who knelt beside me on an ordinary evening and asked to be taught how to mend a torn seam, because he wanted, for one honest hour, to be useful rather than powerful." The title came after. The love came first. Remember that. Whatever fine name is ever offered you, the love must always come first, or it is not worth having at all. And on the evenings when Sebastian joined them there, settling into the same chair he had once occupied as a stranger in a plain coat, he would watch his wife teach their daughter the quiet art of mending, and think, as he thought every single time, that he had never in his life been more grateful for a single moment of cowardice as he was for the night he had lingered too long outside a sewing-room door, unable to make himself walk away from the small, steady light of a woman who had taught him, stitch by patient stitch, precisely what it meant to be truly and honestly loved.